and welcome to Capital's Sports special interview with Kristen Worley, who I'm absolutely delighted to be joined with from Canada. So we have Dublin in Canada tonight, and Alan has finally let me loose on the show without any supervision. So Kristen, I am absolutely delighted to get the opportunity to chat to you about, I'd like to say we can talk about everything. So if we can perhaps start, I am fascinated by your childhood because you are not just a cyclist. You were a water skier, long distance runner. Basically, if you could compete in it, you were doing it. So I suppose I'd love to know the genesis of how you came to cycling and also your love of sports, which I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was very much an escapism thing for you. It comes across as this was your form of the place where you could excel and feel comfortable. And I think that's really important when we get a bit further along to explore this aspect now and sports for you.
It's wonderful to meet you as well. I mean, I've come to know you over the years, and I'm glad that we finally had a chance to connect this way. And so I'm really grateful that Alan has been able to connect us this way and have this one-to-one conversation. And I really appreciate you asking me that question right off the start of this conversation, because it doesn't happen very often. Let's be honest in this space. So it is very much connected, and I appreciate you asking. And it's really interesting because for many who may not know, I'm also a New Zealander. I recently actually received my New Zealand citizenship. I was actually born of a New Zealand mom who left Christchurch back in the day at age 23, to which she left by ship, all by herself, traveled across 6 weeks across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal and up through the Atlantic, arriving through New York into Toronto, pregnant with me. So, and absolutely knowing nobody. So that's really where this journey began for me, and how it kind of connects to sport. Because I say a lot of the times now, a lot of the things that we've evolved to over the last many years has really been due to my mom making those commitment decisions to seek a better life for me outside of New Zealand at that time, somewhere else in the world, and she chose Canada at the time to do that. So for me, coming back to your original question about sport, I actually was adopted into an upper middle class Canadian family. What I call my autobiography, kind of the platinum triangle of Canadian sport, or the Olympic sporting movement in Canada. And I'd be honest with you, I wasn't a very good athlete. I was very much a creative kid, and sport didn't come easily to me. I mean, I was one of those kids in Canada where we have a program in our development cycles in Canada for Canada, the Canadian government, to measure sporting participation and health of youth in the country. And it was under the participation, it was called. And they had every year we would go through a testing system, which I dreaded because it was bronze, silver, gold, and award of excellence. And I was always the kid who got the thanks for coming out ribbon. So as for me, sport did not come easily. And for the reasons that I got engaged in sport was very much, as you were saying, was more of a way of initially protecting myself, because I was very bullied in my early public school days. And I didn't know at that time, back in those particular days, when it came to gender or sexuality and so on, how I was actually presenting myself to my community and my friends at school. And so I was actually very much a target. And so I lived a lot in my creativity as a kid, as kind of a way of surviving through my school system. But it was really back in grade 7 middle school, I learned I could run, and I could actually run quickly. And so running, actually, and even to this day, has always been kind of at the foundation of everything of my sporting activity. Anywhere I go in the world, I'm always running. But at that time, sport, I realized that I could actually create an identity separate of my friends that I could physically identify with me, that in which the bullying stopped. So that's how I got involved in sport. It wasn't something that I actually wanted to do or got involved in. As I was saying, it didn't come easily. So it was really more of a device of protection, and I just kind of fell into it. And I actually was setting school records and so on. So
But that totally explains, you've actually explained so well there the fact that it's the determination part. And I think that also goes to show where you've taken your life since then from childhood, in terms of every time you've been confronted with an issue, you've done what you needed to do on so many different levels to keep that determination to improve.
Is very much at that time, it was very much a survival, and obviously back in those particular days, we didn't have the internet the way we do today, and a lot of the stuff in terms of gender, because I was actually having issues 4, 5, and 6 years old. I was having quite extreme aspects of what we call what we now know as gender dysphoria, because I had a very low receptor uptake that was causing me to have these biological differences going on in my day-to-day life. So, and again, I grew up in a conservative family. We did not talk about these things, let alone sexuality. We certainly did not talk about gender. So, when I got involved in my running evolved, then kind of moved into a place of water skiing. Ironically, my family was a snow skiing, sailing family. My father was a world champion in sailing. And everybody was trying to push me in that trajectory. But I found water skiing, of all things. And by the time I was 9, 10 years old, I was well on the trajectory, the elite trajectory. And by the time I was 15, 16 years old, I was on the national team. And by that time, by grade 10, I had actually competed and skied my first world championships for Canada, representing Canada. So I was really much on the fast track in that trajectory. But also what it did for me was also 2 things. It elevated me within a community that people would recognize me, which kind of would separate the reality of who Kristen was and who the athlete created a separate persona, which people could identify with. But also I was traveling a lot down in the southern states, and spent a lot of my time down in Central Florida, which is kind of the world's training areas for the sport of water skiing globally. So I spent a lot of my time away from home, so that it allowed me to manage a lot of the diversity issues that I was having. But the other part of it was that with my endurance sport that I was training with my water skiing also helped me to manage the gender dysphoria. It was a win-win from the protection to the health piece. But by grade 10, because it was such an adrenaline thing, our connection for me to resolve a lot of these anxieties, actually in grade 10, I became anorexic. So it became very much an extreme, because I was dealing with the body images issues as well, as a young person.
And it's something
I had no place to go and talk to anybody about it, or even a counselor. The closest thing I had was my grandmother, and she knew that I was a creative kid, but didn't realize the fundamental connections that were going on internally at the time. So I had her support in many other ways, but really I was very much alone. So sport enabled me to kind of have that layer of protection that I needed at the time. Because for me, because I didn't understand what was going on and why it was happening, I was afraid that I was going to lose my family, my friends, my network, all those other things that people normally don't have to think twice about. But I was thinking about these things at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, because I didn't understand why I was reacting this way and behaving this way. And I just felt that I was some bad child.
Whereas the reality is there are now adults who have the same issues and can't deal with them or express or comprehend them. And you're trying to do that as a child in a world where, let's face it, the supports and resources, they're scarce there now as it is in our modern society, let alone at the time. And I suppose this would probably bring me into, you went down the route of, you got married to Ali,
mm-hmm.
and then you were in your late 20s when you made the decision to transition.
Right. So for me, I was in a kind of a transitional space in my life. So I actually returned when I was so this comes back to the water skiing history. Back in when I was going to school, high school, to go to a secondary education. Well, everybody would fall into that process, right? Into that cycle. But as for many high performance elite athletes, we didn't have what we have today, where you can go to school and train and seek your sporting career at the same time. So you would miss out on that 3 to 4 or 5 year gap while you're competing in your sport, and then having to re-enter into the education program and to get your college or university education, to seek a professional life. So so in the trajectory, as I was reintroduced back to meeting Allison, as you're just saying, I met her at a university event. Subsequently, while I was still competing, and I actually had gone into cycling, and I was actually competing internationally. And what had happened was, about 2 years later, after we connected, I would go down in a terrible road accident where I would shatter my pelvis, and it literally almost took me a year to learn how to walk again. So my Olympic aspirations, in terms of my trajectory from the sport of water skiing, which was an Olympic affiliated sport, but I would never go to the Olympic Games. Yeah. I decided I would go to the sport that I was training in, which was cycling. And I had the great foundational part of my life from all the years of water skiing, that comes that elite thinking and the coaching and all those other things that is part of the development cycle. I already had it established. So I moved very quickly in the elite road cycling side of things, because I had that foundational.
It can totally be cross-applied to a different, the same mentality goes across the board. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So what happened for me was I would then shatter my pelvis in a road accident, and it was actually back just after the time a very good friend of mine who you might know and your listeners might know, by the name of a Canadian by the name of Brian Stemmel. Brian had a terrible accident in Kitzbühel, and Brian had a history. He's a dear friend of mine in the Stemmel family. Brian had a history of being extremely talented. He comes from a German background. He and his sister Karen were both on the national team and skied on World Cup. Exceptional athletes and just really good people as a whole. But Brian was a daredevil. Brian was exceptionally talented, and he had a really good sense of flight and body awareness in the air and when he was skiing. And took a lot of chances. But the one thing that Brian didn't have was a lot of the will to wanting to do a lot of background training. So a lot of times the Canadian team, when they were training down in Argentina in the summertime, wouldn't take Brian, because he just does say, well, you're not doing any dryland training, so we're not going to take you down to do some of your regular on snow training because of it. So Brian's dad, Will Stemmel, would get Brian to come and cycle with me, and we would train together. And so Brian would get some of his dryland training in while I was actually training for cycling. So we had a really great relationship. But subsequently of this story, Brian would have his terrible fall in Kitzbühel, and then the latter of that, I would have almost took his life, by the way. But then I would have this life-shattering situation of my own many months later, where I shatter my pelvis and take me right out of the sport as well. So we understand we as athletes, as much as we all like to believe, we are not invincible. We can be injured. We can. It's a real.
And when athletes
that reality sinks in,
the injuries are generally much larger, and it's impacting every part of your life. It's not like when someone has an accident and they still have work to distract them as they heal. Everything's gone.
Exactly, and I think because we as athletes, and particularly at that time where we didn't have the education, we didn't have the educational support, it was hard to think of a subsequent career. And so at that time, because you were so focused just on your training and on your sport, and it was 6-7 days a week, and the hundreds of thousands of hours that we spend doing it. So it's all we knew, and so you're always in that cycle. And so that's your life. And so when something falls apart or an injury occurs of subsequently almost, as Brian's case, almost taking his life, and me breaking my pelvis, it's life changing. It's true. You're never the same. And I know I can vouch that for Brian as well, because it was never the same for him. And I know for me, I can still feel that injury today. And I know now what we now know about my journey after this, in terms of where I would transition, and never thought I would ever come back to sport, was actually, I look at it more as it was part 2 of my journey in my sporting career. And this the injury was to say, it's not your time yet. There's something else that's going to happen before this. And the injury provoked that to happening, and stopping my life for a period of time.
It's one of those moments where you realize you have to make whatever changes you want in your life to really live it.
Yeah, it was it was, I thought my gender dysphoria all my life. And it put me in the most oddest places in my family growing up as a child. It's really hard to explain to people how physical it is, even at 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. But for me, I always thought I could beat it. And for me, what happened is when I went then back to design school, of course, my elite training decreased. I would get out in the mountain bike once in a while and do some local training and, just for fitness, but it wasn't enough to fend off the levity of what's the gender dysphoria that I had because of my low receptor uptake. So it became again front and center in my life. And I would try to take my life 3 times. I tried to commit suicide 3 times over a period of those many months, of many years, because I was actually, as you know, I was married to Allison. But also, along with that, afraid of losing her, afraid of losing my family, afraid of losing all my connections to friends and all those circles of industry friends and so on. What I was fearful as a child, I would eventually lose.
You've come full circle. You've now
full circle. And what I knew as a child and what I was afraid of at 4, 5, 6, 7 years old became my reality in my late 20s. And I actually haven't seen my adoptive family in over 20 years. So many of the things that have occurred since that period of time to where I am today, and many of the things that people see in the media and all those other things, has very much been independently on my own.
Which is an incredibly lonely and difficult journey to go on, but obviously one that you have paved the way for so many people. And what I'm going to say is we are going to go into the next section when we come back to talk about your case. But I do have a question for you, because now that we've mentioned Alison, and it's Alison, if you don't mind me saying,
ask her.
Use the language. Right. She sounds like a badass. I loved reading the kind of things.
She is. Yeah.
You were too nervous to stare at people when you were out and stare them down. She was doing it. She told a census guy that, like, she's literally like, no, he's dead. This is the person who lives here, kind of thing. She had a real ability to probably do things you weren't mentally ready to do in terms of fighting back. And when you're doing the initial things, like go shopping for women's clothing, you need the ability to work yourself up to those things. And she was there to be your Rottweiler beside you, kind of making sure everything.
Well, yeah, and she's my soulmate, and she still is today. I mean, we remained married together for over 10 years through that. And as people will recognize, my last name is Worley. So I changed my surname to Worley, which is of her family. And Allison is become my younger sister, and who used to be my sister-in-law, Amanda, my older sister-in-law, is now my older sister. And we are 3 sisters, and in the Worley family. And my stepfather, Graham Worley, he was a lawyer from the UK, QC. And he ran actually back in the day with Roger Bannister. He was there on the day when Roger and the three others broke the 4-minute mile. And so Dad ran in. He ran in the same running group. And I actually have when he passed away back just before the '88 Olympics, and I actually have their high school medallions from when they ran in high school, and what then was the 4x440. So yeah, so he's willed all that to me. I have that all on record. So yeah, it's very much back in the day when people would, remember the film Chariots of Fire. It was very much of that relationship my father had. And he ran 10 to 12K every single day of his life. And he had, unfortunately, he had a rare, started off as prostate cancer, rare bone cancer. And then by the age of 78, he ironically lost use of his legs, paralyzed for the last 5 months of his life. So the irony of that, because the one thing that he loved the most was to run. Was taken away from the last 5 months of his life. So, but he was the rock in our family, and he was, even today, the things that I do in sport and internationally is certainly a reflection of his commitment to me. And as a parent, I mean, if you want to think about it, I've had 3 sets of parents, and he's of my 3 fathers is the only one that never failed me, and stood beside me, and our sport, our love for running and our sport, because we ran marathons together and so on. He never wavered.
I do think the universe has a way of helping people find the right families for them, and it certainly gave you the right one in the end.
Absolutely.
It took a bit of time, but the important thing is good things come to those who wait.
Absolutely.
I have been told by Alan we are going to jump into a break, and when we come back, I'm going to bore you with some legal questions.
Not too boring. I'm glad we're having them. I look forward to it.
I'm really looking forward to chatting about it. It's so important to know the backstory so we can then go from there into how you pioneered into the world of law and have paved the way for some of the biggest names in sports law cases in history that we all see now. So we're going to jump into our break now.
Well done.
And we are back. Alan didn't give me a prior warning. We were jumping back on there, but sure, look. So I am delighted to still have Kristen with us, and we are going to hopefully talk all things law. And I'm hoping we can discuss two cases in particular, Kristen's own case, and we're also going to discuss the impact that has had on, or the impact her influence has had on other cases and her support for other athletes, which is obviously an incredibly important thing for all of us to consider. As we now go into a phase where sometimes I feel that the world is going backwards when it comes to some of the positions being adopted by sports governing bodies. So I suppose we're going to talk about your case. And when we talk about the case you took, we have to start with why you took your case. And it's very important to mention the process for gender identification, and I don't even know what you would call it. It almost seems like something that came out of the 1980s, because it did actually. There was that sort of idea of a physical and supervised gender inspection almost.
Yeah, just to give everybody, so I can really help just quickly. I mean, it really started back in the 1930s, where they were looking for individuals with ambiguous sex. And it would randomly happen, particularly in athletics, and it typically, just historically, much of this incubated out of athletics. The issues around gender and all gender testing and all the other things. It's been really an incubation out of what we now know as world athletics, and so that's historical. And so back in the 50s and the 60s, I mean, there was times where women would get a gender verification card when they would come to an Olympic event, and you would have to go through what was called the gender parade. So they actually had an image, the athlete's name, country, and age, and so on, and sport, and so on, which they had to have approved of going through a gender test. So there was a physical gender parade of women, and then as horrible as that is, and I always find it fascinating to hear the different views of physicians around this. They always kind of go, well, it's done by women, and I'm thinking, well, so what? It's just a horrible thing in the first place.
It doesn't make a difference if it's done by dogs. It's not
right.
Who's doing it. It's the fact that it's happening.
Right. That's right. They don't go back to square one. They don't go back to the beginning where the conversation needs to happen and why it's happening. And so the other thing is also around the issues around. So what they did leading up to that, all the women, of course, were complaining about it and saying it was too invasive, blah 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 blah. Of course it is, horrifying. In all levels, and so what they did what was called the buccal smear test. So it's taking a saliva testing from the inside of the mouth, which would pick up on the DNA. The DNA test that then stopped in 1967. Arne Lindquist, who was the IOC Medical Commission director, he actually wasn't a medical doctor. He was a research oncologist. So the IOC at the time typically had a history of, there's a history of not so much Professor Lindquist, but there was other incidences of where the IOC in past physicians or people had 1-year medical degrees sitting in positions within the IOC that became more predominant than actual people who were actually accredited doctors outside the system. So it's better to keep it in-house rather than keeping it out of the house. So in 1968, before the Mexico City Summer Olympics, gender testing and the buccal smell test was stopped. But in reality, it never was stopped. So it really seemed to poke the bear again. Is when, and this is where a lot of people and this has been part of the problems with the media and a lot of the marketing and a lot of other people that maybe should have never been in this conversation in the first place. And I don't want to go down the Castor path right now, but in terms of, this all began back with Michel Dumaras back in 1999 and in year 2000, 10 years before Castor ever came around. This is where this all began and became highlighted when Michel, who I know personally, came into the downhill mountain biking scene in Canada, and was found out that she had transitioned in her life. And of course, Sport Canada, the UCI, which is the World Cycling, went, oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this athlete? And panicked. So ironically, I received a call from a fellow by the name of Dr. Ross Outerbridge, who knew me knew I had transitioned years ago. Ross was head of the then International Water Ski Federation, but he was actually a very big supporter of me during my duration and development into the sport of water skiing, and became very close. So Ross privately called me and asking me if I could help. So I said to him and to Sport Canada, I would be happy to help with the assurance that this won't be, I will stay out of this publicly, because I never intended to come back to sport. That was never my intention. I was already in my design career, my architectural world, and I was well on my way. So one thing led to another. I was able to give the UCI, Sport Canada, and so all the necessary medical information, documentation to help Michelle get her license back. Because I had all the research from me working with some of the very top experts in the world in this field in my own transitions years before. So I was able to supplement this discussion, to which Michelle got her license back. And so Michelle was like 64th, 65th in the world, and on World Cup. I think she had a top 20 placing once or twice. But Canada was on the we were in our infancy in downhill mountain biking at the time, and Norba was really big in the United States and Europe. She was nowhere near being a competitive athlete in this space, but it all became about because of her label, because it was recognized that she had transitioned in her life, and going, oh my God, that this athlete is going to take advantage of women's sport, and what are we going to do with her? And of course, that was never the case at all. I would then meet Michelle several weeks later, because Cycling Canada would call me and ask me if could Michelle talk to you and thank you for all the help you gave. So that's where this has transpired from. And so what had happened at that time, so this is 2002, 2003, just before the Greece Olympics, the IOC then assumed the position as the overseer of Olympic sport, as they assume. And everybody needs to acknowledge as well, the IOC is like the 10th largest sporting organization in the world. It's not the number one size sporting entity in the world. It's just that it's been marketed that way. So they're roughly the 10th in the world. There's even a Japanese baseball association, and that's larger than in terms of the scale and scope of the IOC. So just to give everybody kind of a sense of scale and kind of a little bit more truth to the historical record. So, but the IOC, we assume, because of the brand, they are assumed the overseers of Olympic sport and Olympic activities in nations like Ireland and Canada, and other particularly Commonwealth nations, European nations are signatories to that relationship. So our governments go under those relationships and sign on to the autonomy of sport and the guidance of the Olympic movement, which we use here in Canada, and the Paralympic movement as well. So anyway, to make a long story short, I would be the first athlete in the world to go through the first gender policy by the IOC. I was the very first athlete in the world to do so back in 2004, 2005. So, which was horrific. I can't speak to all the details because I am under with portions of my legal case. I can talk to it generally, but there is some stuff that's under
NDAs.
Yeah. So, but I can talk generally about it, and I can certainly talk to the areas around with WADA and also with the IOC because I don't have a contract with them. So we can talk more openly about that to give everybody a bigger picture. So I was gender tested. I went psychologically and physically by eight individuals, and it was through the UCI and groups here in Canadian actor sports groups here in Canada. It was all done by men, and not once did they ever ask not once did they ever ask to include women in the conversation. I was very much on my own. And the interesting thing is in 2006, 2007, which we have on record, my body would begin to fail me because I was an athlete which a lot of people where we are today, we're always talking about this kind of trans umbrella, this label. That label is horrific because it doesn't represent the majority of the athletes that are participating in sport. And it's misrepresenting the physiology and also the sciences, but also the health concerns.
And this is when you had your concern needing synthetic testosterone.
That's correct. So right. That's right. So so my body would begin to fail me horrifically in 2005 to 2006 because of my transition and because the IOC had never done the science and the research to any of these policies that they published. The issue was that my body, we didn't know anything. So basically you're taking the engine, the gas out of the engine because my primary hormone, being an XY karyotype, is testosterone. That's the single primary testosterone. Where yours is progesterone and estrogen, which also is anabolic, created within the gonads. Okay, but whereas testosterone is secondary to you. So, and that is just typically done because of nature and reproductive reasons. Period. So that's how our bodies work. We are comparing apples to oranges. We will never be the same, ever. Ever. Unless there's some kind of Darwinian moment that occurs in our lifetime. We will never see it from centuries.
But you're now at a point where your body is saying, hold on, and you've done the research, you know exactly that what your body needs now is synthetic testosterone.
Well, my body needs androgens, testosterone, right? Yeah. So my body, because it's like taking the gasoline out of your car. And what happens when we take the gasoline out of our cars? Our cars start to shimmy and shake because there isn't enough support fuel to be able to sort the health functions of the physiology. Okay, so no one talks about this because they don't think like this. They think about males in sport and females in sport, and they have a socialization that they think one over the other, and this is what happens. They don't actually have thought about what happens during that transition. So for me, this is really simple for the listeners, there's two things. Was one, which is what we call a complete androgen deprivation. So you're taking the primary hormone out of the physiology for the bodies that it needs to maintain function, let alone health on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so when I have the surgical intervention on my body, the gonads were removed from the physiology to create the vulva. Okay, so gonads are ovaries because we all start off as female, and then we, depending on the SRI gene, which is the Y gene, will then make testicles, eventually making the male sex characteristics. It is the same function. It's the same thing, right? When we start off, right? They create the majority of the primary hormones for our physiology. Certainly, other organs of the body create other hormones, but at a very minimal level. But that's the majority of where we get it from. So also what a lot of people don't understand is that we have an endocrine system. And so we have the hypothalamus gland and the pituitary gland from the brain that goes down, it circles down to the major organs and then circles down to the gonads. Okay, and then they circle back to the organs, back to the brain, because then the messaging that comes up from the hypothalamus gland and the pituitary gland are constantly synchronized to be able to message the various organs, message the gonads eventually to increase the hormone levels to help with day-to-day body function, health, and well-being, and especially when you're doing sporting activity, to increase your primary hormone to help with recovery.
So
and
you're now
exercise.
You're now at a position where your brain has nothing to send its message to get back your hormone levels up effectively, and you're also training like an athlete, which means your body is naturally, and I know people associate being an athlete with like being in peak health, but you're actually training, so your body is probably quite battered. You're putting so much pressure on your body.
Right. We now know because you're taking the gas out of the engine. So just think when you and I are training. Say if you and I go on a bike ride, let's go cycling. And what happens because your body hasn't been interrupted and mine has. Okay. So what happens? You and I go out and are doing 60 kilometers on the bike, and what happens is, okay, our pituitary gland and hypothalamus gland start sending messages out, responding to the euphoria feelings that we feel when we do exercise, right? And so what happens, that messaging goes out. The signal is no different than it is for you and for you. But what happens is because I have that disconnection and I don't have the gonad response, the message goes out, but there's nothing to connect it to. Okay, so what happens? My body goes like this, and your body goes like this, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't have the mechanisms to support the activity that I'm doing. So the issue is, and it's different for athlete to athlete, because there's actually athletes that have what we call androgen receptors in the XY karyotype. So it's the ability to absorb testosterone. So some people may have lower testosterone levels,
yeah,
but have higher receptor uptake. So they may not feel the same level as say I did as an athlete, because I had low testosterone with low receptor uptake. So I'm funky all the time. Okay, but for some transition athletes, they may have because it's unique to their physiology, they may have a slight uptake in their receptor uptake, so they may not feel as impacted with the lower testosterone or non-existent testosterone in their physiology.
You've hit on a really important point there. You said unique, and that's because it is an individual thing. It's not just something we can look at and say, here's testosterone levels, let's cap at a certain level, or let's use this as our metric, because testosterone is one factor that is often thrown out there without a look at the entire picture.
That's correct. And the issue is, and it's shameful. That's shameful medicine and shameful science. And it's actually, speaking to many of my human rights colleagues internationally, it's a human rights issue in terms of the physiological impact in terms of, there's a whole legal context to that, and what you're doing incredibly harm to a human being.
And suppressing testosterone is also a painful process that we're asking athletes to think should just be considered like de facto as your method to get into a sport.
Right. The thing is to understand all the sciences exist, and we already understand what low testosterone does within hypogonadism. It's very common with low androgen levels, and WADA has sciences to be able to support the XY karyotype males with low testosterone, which you can get therapeutic exemptions to be able to elevate testosterone, to be able to equate that level of health. So the WADA and the IOC are very, very well aware of this, and so this has very much a political issue over many decades, and one that I talk about often. Which I'm sure we can talk about. This is more about an issue of a statement against interest, and what the IOC really didn't want to know back in 2004, 2005, that they never did the research to any of this in the first place. So it was only in 2008 when my body had completely failed me, and I had reached out to Jacques Rogue when he was the CEO of the IOC at the time, and by chance I got him on the phone, and he said to me, he goes, "Kristen," in his Belgian voice, he's a lovely man, and he says, "We've been following you, we've been wanting to talk to you," and so on. And where everybody else was trying to push me away, and he was just delightful. So he accelerated this interaction, to which then we had a meeting with the Canadian government on a conference call that following September with Patrick Shumash, who was then the vice president of the Medical Commission, where eventually in the conversation with members of the Canadian government and heads of sport, with me on the phone, where he would admit they never did the science and the research. So that was the first time the government of Canada would learn that they raped me, and it was purely because of the label. My label changed, that they felt that they took upon themselves the policies to which the IOC had instigated back in 2004 as being as a method to ensure the access point for athletes into sport who had gone through transition. But that was the methodology, the consensus form to do it. So that's when the IOC, eventually Patrick would, in his disgruntled voice, because he was more upset that I had got him into a place where he had to admit in front of Canadian leadership. It was more of a place of his embarrassment as an Olympic official, where he had to admit that this never happened, that they never did it. So, and then when he was asked by one of the ethics and sports people, head of our anti-doping here in Ottawa, what we should do about it, he yells over the phone. He yells over the phone in the conference call. He goes, "Get Kristen to get us to science and research." It was very, very rough and boisterous, and he was very angry.
Little did he know you'd be delighted to get him the science and research.
Yeah. But I had to reflect back to him. I said, "Well, it's the Dr. Shumash, that was your job." And I said, "Before you and the IOC published what the world thought you had created these policies to which gender testing is occurring, to understand, and you're talking in front of the Canadian government on this conference call and admitting that you never did it.
Which is in itself frightening. We are going to jump into a break because I think this is a good point where we're going to come back and say and discuss where sport has gone since your victory in the Canadian courts on a human rights issue to where we are now. And we are very briefly and only in very broad stroke, I am going to mention Castor. We're not going to discuss her case. I would just like to mention the support aspect and where we're going now, hopefully. So we are going to jump into our break now. And we are back. We are mastering the transitions, excuse the word pun, back from the breaks much better now. Yeah. So I'm delighted that myself and Kristen are going to now talk about where sports has gone or possibly reversed back into rather than where we're going into the future. So I suppose, Kristen, you had your victory and this meant a huge thing because it was recognizing that not only was it a recognition from a court that these bodies needed to go away and examine their policies, but there was a clear commitment by the various sporting bodies involved that they were going to go away, they were going to assess their policies and take action to look at how they were dealing with inclusivity in their sports and whether their policies were in fact based on anything more than the idea that no one would question whether or not they did the research. Because if you have a policy in place, no one actually asks, what have you guys done to verify this? So we've got to that point. They went away. How did you feel, I suppose, the initial period after they had gone away and their commitment? Did you feel reassured that this commitment was a firm one? And did you feel this was really going to progress matters ahead? And what was the moment when you went, this has made a difference in terms of their actual commitment?
Oh God, no. I may take everybody back just before that. So
Brilliant.
I want to be able to say I remember back in 2011 when John Fahey was head of the World Anti-Doping Agency. John has now passed away, I guess 2 years ago. But I'll never forget it when the WADA had set up the athlete phone line. And so to be able to call into WADA and ask questions. So I did that and through an email and so on. 3 weeks later, I received a cease and desist letter by email from the lawyers in Montreal from WADA telling me to stop asking questions. I was directed from John Fahey. I never met John Fahey in my life. I entered into it as asking as an athlete. I was not trying to be problematic or anything. That's what I got. And so so I wanted to be able to say, so from the period of 2008 to 2013, to which inevitably what I would call the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland, that there was a severe oppression towards me as seen as a problem between the IOC, the UCI, WADA, and the Canadian government. Because they knew what I knew and also the impact that it had traumatized me and the maltreatment that I received and the long-term impact of that. They didn't want the world to know. So the issue is, so in 2013, I actually made a call to the Court of Arbitration in Switzerland. I've got this young Italian lawyer, and it was the only one call I ever made. And he said to me, he goes, Kristen, he said, this is exactly what he said. He goes, we thought one day, he knew who I was. And he goes, we thought one day you might bring this here to us. The Court of Arbitration is not the right place to come to. We're not a court of law. We are a mediation body. We focus on anti-doping and contract law. And by the way, the other side has to show up. The other side, what he was indicating was the IOC. So he sent me 2 PDFs of cases to reflect on to illustrate why this wasn't appropriate. Obviously, he was trying to steer me down the civil and human rights trajectory. Yeah. So I thought about it for about a year after that. My body had completely failed me by that point in time. So I was never going to return to sport. But what typical of what I've learned from a lot of survivors, because I'm now a recognized survivor by the IOC as well, is that we typically don't want this to happen to anyone else. That's really the issue. So what I was able to do was to decouple myself I made the commitment to decouple myself from the UCI, so from the autonomy of sport, to which I was able to get jurisdiction on the IOC, the UCI, Cycling Canada, and Ontario Cycling bodies here, all 4 bodies, to which inevitably we later got jurisdiction on WADA as well months later, where it technically made sense in our legal process. The IOC at that time would try to fight their way out of human rights, and twice they presented 2 different forms of policy. One back in the early days, once they received their as a responder, as a legal term, as you know.
Yeah.
They had to respond to what was presented to them, and all 4 bodies then who were then could respond. They responded very little. But what I did, I kept 15 years of archived every email, every correspondence, every conversation over 15 years up in the cloud for a particular moment, and this was the moment. And we wrote an 87-page response. It was like boom, 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 boom to all the organized. It was like it just laid it all out. And this is what you said on this day. We had it all laid out for them. So the IOC then hosted in 2000, and they tried to do is try to avoid going to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal with all the other respondents. They didn't want to show up in the tribunal. So what they tried to do was to set up go into the civil courts here in Toronto, to which we did. But what they would do, they would host a one-day health events, science events in November. Then they would then rewrite the policy, the gender policy, and removing sex reassignment from the policy. So because I had gotten jurisdiction, so they weren't making an issue of it because they never thought I would get past the autonomy. So the autonomy is where they control it at the CAS, right? So this is really important for all athletes on all issues. It's not just around the gender issues. This is why we need to break outside of the court of arbitration and look at individual tribunals and individual nations' courts to protect athletes. So this is part of that bigger discussion we need to be having in the future. But this is an example of that. But the IOC then would try to limit their accountability coming into Toronto. They would first advertise this policy change in the middle of January in 2016 to the public to say, oh, we've changed our ways and we've taken sex reassignment out of policies and blah, 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 blah. But really what they were doing was to limit their accountability in the courts. So the issue, there was no science and research behind the policy. They layered in the masthead with all these scientists who are connected to the IOC. There was absolutely nothing to it. And what they were trying to do was to try to bring it into court, in the civil court on the 28th of February, to which it was thrown out. So it never saw the light of day. But then that was the moment. So coming back to your question, that never saw the light of day. So I remember walking out after we won that day with them, is that I realized, and I remember saying to my lawyers and many athletes that were there in Toronto with me, supporting me, we realized, we were saying, oh my God, they're not going to tell the world that the policy one was thrown out, and secondly, there's no science and research to any of it. So weeks later, this is during the prelim before the Olympics in Rio. Thomas got up and stood up in a press conference saying, we got this brand new policy, blah, 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 all this, this is the new trajectory for the IOC, blah, blah, blah. Not telling the world that it had been thrown out in Toronto. And the Chief Justice, Harriet Sack, who was one of Canada's top female human rights lawyers in the civil courts, threw it out because she knew exactly what the IOC was trying to do. It was trying to limit their accountability. And what we had to remind them behind the scenes was that even how wrong that policy was in the first place, with the means of which they were doing it, we had to remind them that it's really what's happened in the past and the trauma and impact of what's happened. So it was all about trying to limit their accountability to the trauma, the maltreatment, and the impact of that, to me, historically since 2005, virtually, and their ability to want to limit that impact to them personally. So they were trying to lay that response back to me, to which, as well reported, the IOC was saying before we came into the civil courts, when I got jurisdiction, was that this would impact the Olympic movement and also their Swiss sovereignty. So here I am, the survivor, the traumatized athlete through all of this, and here the IOC is projecting publicly about them being one that this is my fault. They're taking it outside of the autonomy, outside of the Court of Arbitration, which the Court of Arbitration recommended to me to do, and did not support the IOC's trajectory, and made it my problem. And so and I was the survivor. So I've said to them recently, which we can now fast forward, is all they wanted to do 5 years ago was to hit the survivor with a bigger hammer. And you know,
I think you made a really important point, and I know you made a really important point, but when you mentioned the Court of Arbitration in Sport and CAS and its jurisdiction, CAS not only is it an arbitrary in terms of arbitration, that's its entire function, the Court of Arbitration, but it also has a limited appeal function to the Swiss courts. So you don't have the option where, let's say, if you have a judgment in Ireland in one court, you can appeal to a higher court, and then on a point of law, you can go to another higher court, and then you can go to Europe. So by taking, and the problem is a lot of courts, what they do when they see a case involving athletes or sporting bodies in front of them, they say, hi guys, no, we don't have room for you here. There's a court in Switzerland that's got sport in its name, go there. And it's built into so many of the sporting bodies' charters that this is where you go first. And the reality is, for an athlete, if you're going to CAS and then seeking to go elsewhere, the financial implications, unless you're being backed, to bring even Castor Semenya, and I am going to mention her here briefly, her legal team and her experts who she brought with her were world-renowned on the area of gender, and in her specific DSD case, because that's a very different case she was taking in relation to it, but the principles remained the same. There was an arbitrary policy put in place that impacted her in a way it didn't impact other athletes, because they chose events and made a kind of a, oh, coincidentally, these are two events you compete in, Castor. We're putting a policy in place.
Yeah, so I can help you. I can help you with that. So I've known Greg not from the second day that this ever happened to Castor back in 2009. It was I was one of the first people Greg reached out to, and so on. So I've known this for a very long time. I would disagree with you in terms of the level of expertise that you're actually talking about, because the science and the research is exactly the same, pretty much, to what we're talking about.
I suppose the experts, I think the quality of her experts to present.
I think there's a tremendous lack of experts, and I think there is, in that particular case, there are people that should never have been in the conversation in the first place, and they were using it as a marketing place for them as social scientists and to achieve other goals. Castor should have been at the other side of this 7 or 8 years ago, and I can tell, and that is the fact. I mean, I've already been through this. I've talked to Greg extensively about this. I was asked to join in the Duty Chan case with the guys here in Toronto. I met with the lawyers here in Toronto originally who were supporting that whole process at the CAS. I said I wouldn't. I come from a legal family, and actually the firm that the guy was actually working at, my father was actually one of the premier founders of that firm at the time. So originally, yeah. So I was sitting here listening to these lawyers talk, and I'm kind of going, you don't know what you're talking about, and that was in the back of my mind. And at the same time, they were asking me, well, don't you want to, Kristen, you want to help everybody, blah, 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 right? And I said, of course I do. But I said, you don't know what you're talking about. And I was about to set my application in as happened that August. But they were trying to get me to come in on the Duty Chan and Castor's case as support, as to being that person, right? And I declined, because I told them, I said, you don't know what you're doing. And I said, you're doing this for all the wrong reasons. And I'm moving ahead. And they told me I was going to fail. And so, which of course was 180 degrees. They failed and I succeeded, and I only did it once. So the issue is, that's really important when we look at how the media has projected this whole case in terms of the timeline between 2009 to 2022, where we are today with Castor, over was it 13 years now.
Still waiting for her European court date, and that'll be another
right. Well,
one.
so different than it being in the courts in Toronto, right? So that could have happened 7-8 years ago if Greg had made the right decisions. I'm fortunate. I'm not bitter about it, but I think in terms of the legal trajectory to which this took, first of all, never needed to happen. Greg already had the information on my case and how I succeeded in Toronto. But it proceeded to the Court of Arbitration with those people who were assumed experts in this space, and the majority of them are not. And it became a sport issue. It became a media issue, and it's only impacted Castor's life for all the wrong reasons. And what a lot of people don't think about is the long-term impacts of the trauma that we face as survivors, because you've got foundations, you've got human rights groups, and so on, marketing that person's brand, in which they are getting paid, they're getting funded, their universities are getting funded, and it's all nonsense.
You've made a really important point there about the marketing and everything like this, because we've discussed this on the show previously as a group. I found it quite disturbing the way I felt Leah Thomas was thrown into a spotlight without ever deciding to make. Yes, she's an athlete. Yes, she was a public persona, but the media honed in on her on both sides of the discussion about trans inclusion. And she was everywhere. Like, her photo was everywhere, and she didn't ask to be a spokesperson.
Right.
And I think.
So the other, if I can share with you, because I'm seeing some of the things coming in here from listeners. Which
we do have a question there.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of them, some really great ones. So this kind of hits on Laurel and also hits on Leah. If I can talk to those two cases, which are really important, and I'll see about boxing. So first of all, let's talk about Leah. Leah is competing based on the policy that came out of Toronto. Okay, so I've now told you that was a legal mechanism designed by the IOC's lawyers to get themselves out of accountability of the liability of trauma maltreatment that I received over that historical record, because I was able to get jurisdiction outside the cast. They had to be transparent to people they didn't know and people that didn't care about sport but only cared about the well-being of human beings in society. Period. There was no sports politics in that mechanism whatsoever. We became equals in the conversation. They had to answer to the science, to which when they did so, they failed. Okay, so the policy to which Leah, many athletes in Australia, many athletes in particular, unfortunately in the UK as well, are competing on policy that doesn't have any science and research attached to it. So these are athletes that the IOC removes sex reassignment out of the policy statement. So the non-interaction, non-surgical intervention of the physiology, removing the actual development of the gonads, removing the gonads and creating the vulva. So that physiology remains. So it's important to understand that the science and the research was never done. So the athletes assumed, and this is what's really important, the athletes assumed under their contract and license agreement, either it being swimming, track and field, cycling, whatever the sport is, that the IOC had done the research in correspondence with WADA as well, that this had been done when it hadn't been done. Okay, and so the issue is, so that policy, just so everybody knows, that policy didn't even go past the executive board of the IOC. Okay, that's how fast they were in a quick rush to get it done to deal with the issues in Toronto. Period. Okay, that's how problematic this is. So you've got athletes, you've also got provincial, national, state universities, and the NCAA using these policies, thinking that, again, that the leadership of global sport, assumed global sport, had done the research to the policy, which they hadn't done. Okay. So that is very problematic. So you've got athletes who can't respond to it, and then you've got these sporting organizations that can't respond to it because all they can say is, well, the IOC did this, and in fact they didn't. So everybody's doing this, and then you've got the media creating this kind of soup and people hear enough of the raw weaponizing that's gone on. And as we've learned over time, we hear it 3 or 4 times.
No, Alan's going to afford us some more time, because I've just told him now that he is going to afford us some more time.
Yeah. So what's happened? So what's happened is that we've created a situation where we hear mistakes over and over and over again, and even people who are the professionals, we hear that over and over again in our social media sphere, it becomes truth. So, right, and then it becomes highly weaponized because, unfortunately, young athletes who assume the sciences were there, which isn't there, they can't respond to it. And then you've got the sporting organizations who can't either, but are under the umbrella of the signatory relationship to the IOC, so they don't want to upset the IOC and the international bodies when they come out against it. So it's a vicious circle of a problem because it comes back to the issue. It solely comes back to the issue around statement against interest, and all the IOC had to say, we didn't do it. Okay, so this is what's really important because I want to be able to kind of speak of two more cases. We want to talk about Laurel, and I want to talk about Fallon Fox. So the issue around, so that deals with the boxing as well. So Laurel, amazing as she is, okay, and
she didn't.
So she came into weightlifting back in 2011 or 2011. Okay, yeah. She'd been through her transition. I don't want to go into the details of that because that's her privacy. But we know there's a 10-year window when athletes have had surgical intervention on their bodies that eventually their bodies are going to fail them. Okay, so when Laurel went into the Gold Coast Games for the Commonwealth Games, okay, back in 2017, okay, spring of 2017, two of the top physicians in the world who I work with in collaboration with me, we sent out 2 letters to the leadership of the Commonwealth Games Federation 2 weeks before the Commonwealth Games. We were concerned about the changes that we were I hadn't met Laurel by this time. I mean, she's a Kiwi, so I had never met her. And we were noticing the changes in her physiology, which were common to what we knew from what we could just see. And we were concerned about her participation and her safety on the field of play. And so we did not get a call back from the CGF at the time. And I know, and so our letter back in that response, but we have 2 letters that were sent out at that time specifically. And I will never forget when the injury that she had a catastrophic injury to her elbow.
Yes,
I remember. And we actually detailed that concern because we knew ahead of time, because when you take the androgens out of the XY karyotype, one of the big things happens is cell synthesis. So the ability for the body to generate through hormones to regenerate cell tissue. And so in terms of, we do that with the elasticity, and keeps the elasticity of our joints and our joint health. So what happens with her, so when the hormone is gone, it's like using an old elastic band, right? So in her mind, when she signed her athletic contract with World Weightlifting, which then is a signatory relationship to the IOC, which World Weightlifting would have assumed they were following the policy and the science and the research that was there to support Laurel's participation and her safety on the field of play, that work had been done. Okay, it hadn't been done. Okay, so Laurel assumed that she would be safely participating on the field of play. She had an enormous catastrophic injury. Last summer was a very dark time for me. It actually put me back in therapy for a period of time, because what had happened, along with all the weaponizing that we've seen in the United States around the young swimmer, because of my connection to what I knew in 2017 coming out of Toronto and those policies, right? Because I know the truth behind it, and the impact that this was happening on Leah, but also in the communities around the United States, which governments were using to weaponize to exclude young children from sport participation. All of it was untrue. And it was connected to my relationship to Toronto and the IOC, that I was watching this happen. And so it got very dark for me. And so this became even worse, because as I watched a lot of the European acceleration over Laurel's participation at the Olympics, but her drawdown to the games was purely based on COVID-19 and the attrition of girls not being able to get to the games. So she got through that way. And the other important part of it is that the weaponizing and the targeting that came down on her publicly in the BBC and many journalists, the ones that we know very, very well, that have been impacted, who've been kind of weaponizing this, throwing down on her basically because of what she looks like. Okay, four women competed at the Olympic Games. 3 of them, no one even knows who they are. Okay, Laurel was one of 4 participants. Okay, everybody focused on Laurel. Okay, so in doing so, it was a challenge for me last summer to make clear to everybody. I was with the IOC. The IOC was pushing out the issues around she met the mandate, the fairness, and the right to compete. Those are the three top things that they were talking about. And I said back to the International Olympic Committee, I said, that is correct. She has a right to compete, and she met a mandate that there was no science and research, to which she agreed upon in her policy, thinking that you had done it. You have not allowed her to participate or support her safety on the field of play. And that her participation in the sport, in the Olympic Games in Japan, you were putting her at risk on the field of play because her body could not sustain health.
Can I
just finish one piece? Is that we woke up the following day after Laurel's competition. What had happened? She didn't even get past the first race. Because your body had that is the long-term impact of complete androgen deprivation of the physiology, because her body could no longer respond to it.
And there was always going to be that cut-off point, and I suppose you saw it coming probably before she even knew it was coming herself.
That's right. We had to explain it.
I know Alan is going to ask me to wrap up, I am going to ask this question. He's going to murder me afterwards, but boxing in a sentence, do you think there's a safe way of incorporating, and I suppose rugby, they're the two sports that we were asked about. Is there a safe way of incorporating?
There already is. Yeah, there already is. And Alan, just let me just get this one thing in. I was brought in with the issues around with my dear friend Fallon Fox several years ago, and with Florida State boxing, U.S. boxing, and MMA. I'll never forget the call. Unfortunately, the physician, she's no longer alive. She was a New York physician, head of the medical commission for the MMA. And here we were on a call together, a conference call, and she was talking about women athletes in the MMA, in mixed martial arts. And she says, Kristen, she goes, I see all the athletes naked after a fight. I check for bruises, broken bones, and cuts and so on. And Fallon had already been competing at the B level of MMA boxing for 2 years. And so I looked at her, I said, so, you know, and I said to the group, I said, so what changed? What it was she couldn't answer the question because she knew exactly where I was going with it, because she didn't know Fallon had even transitioned. Okay, because it's done by body weight. So the issue is she couldn't tell Fallon standing naked in front of her that she'd been through transition. How she found out was when another athlete outed her, saying that they knew that she had transitioned, and all that whole episode blew up, and it became an issue for the sporting organizations to think that they had to manage it. Okay, so the issue is when we do by the idea around weight and the changes to the physiology, we know there is the issue is really comes down to safeguarding. The issue comes around to being able to, as I've now done in the last 2.5 years with the IOC, because the guidelines that were set out in November, I'm the one who was behind all that. Is because when I reconnected with the IOC back in 2019, this will finish up nicely. I walked into the Olympic House privately on that day, on November 1st, 2019. I said, I am here to ensure the trauma and maltreatment starts and stops at me. And that's the 2.5-year commitment I made to the IOC privately behind the scene, because we know the historical record. We know this has had the enormity of the trauma impact that it's had to athletes worldwide. And the idea, it's based on the framework to which how we do sport. And we're asking a sports system designed by Pierre de Coubertin back in 1896, based on 16 countries on a very Eurocentric framework to answer 21st century questions, which it was never designed to do. So the issue is, it's really us changing the framework and how we're around sport and how we integrate people and how we design and integrate sport, because anything beyond the design Coubertin had made based on a sports system that was designed by men for men to entertain men will always be around accommodation. We need to pivot from the ideas of accommodation to the ideas of integration. And what does sport then, can we reimagine what that would look like without hurting people?
Can I just, while thanking you, I would just like to say it's been an absolute pleasure. You have, I suppose I can honestly say you've changed my view on one and two sports. Boxing is the sport I love more than anything. And I think just the way you explained that there made a huge difference in terms of combat sports, because we already have weight classifications. Why don't we look at how look at how we view sports through the prism of other people's eyes rather than always just our own or what we're taught to expect.
It's just to help on the boxing front, because I know that's a big question.
Yeah.
here in Canada, one of the boxing directors contacted me here in Canada and was asking about creating transgender policy. And then as our conversation went on, just very much like what happened in the United States a few years ago with Fallon. By the way, Fallon left sport because her body could no longer support itself. She only became a B-level fighter. Okay, so I mean, she's wonderful and she's a great person, but certainly not deserving of the history that has been projected on by the media and other groups around the world. It's most of the time true. But anyway, to make a long story short, the gentleman, as lovely as he was here in Canada, this was a few weeks ago, and he says he's talking to me about policy for Canadian boxing, and he said, "Well, we've got 10 athletes in the system," and I said, "So what's the problem?" Right? And he just kind of looked at me, and like, there's this feeling that they need to do something, and really
already included. What do you mean?
You're already doing it. I said, so what's the problem?
Yeah.
Right?
That is amazing, and it is.
Right? It's so socially driven. This is about human behavior. This is all about human behavior. This is all about design, and this is about us reimagining sport and getting out of this vertical model of accommodation and how we think about sport and diversity, and looking at it at a way that we can integrate it and empower the system, that we can have a global system that focuses on harm prevention, health and well-being, and ideologically, what I did from the very beginning of this conversation that was important for me as a child was all about community connection.
You started sports as a young boy who needed sport as your therapy and your form of protection.
Yeah.
And to think that it would be taken away from you when you've transitioned is actually a very frightening thought. And sport should be inclusive for so many reasons. It's a societal benefit too. It has been an absolute pleasure.
All because
Alan will never give me free reign again, because I could have stayed for the rest of the evening. But thank you. Thank you.
I think this has been I'm thankful to you and Alan and to all the listeners. I think this is one of the first of many conversations that's really needed to happen. And I applaud you for allowing this time. And I hope that for many of the listeners, I mean, we can expand on this in greater detail. Unfortunately, I only had an hour, but I think
I would hope Alan will let me do this
happen to kind of get through that historical record. And there's a lot of untruths, unfortunately. And I think that we together can do better. And that's what's really important here. And really looking at sport as a way to connect us all together. And what does that mean when we look at it in a way and reimagine it in a way where we're not harming people.
Thank you so much. And as we sign out, I'd just like to say we're all sports viewers and listeners, hopefully, on the show. So let's think about sports as being our common goal, and let's not have it divide us all up. Good night, all, and we'll see you on Sunday.